The Berlin Wall, the greatest divider of the superpowers during the Cold War era, physically divided the city of Berlin and symbolically separated a bipolar world. So great was the debate over the wall and the competing global economic systems it separated that in the years following the Second World War, East Germans began to flee for the West at great personal risk. The Second World War had ravaged the entire continent of Europe. The victorious Allies met in Potsdam in July of 1945 to discuss how Germany would be treated after the war, how the denazification process would be held, provided provisions about how much money was to be spent in the reconstruction of Germany, and where the dividing lines would be set. It became clear the Western Allies and the Soviet Union did not see eye to eye on the issues surrounding Germany. The stage was set for the division of the country, the continent, and the differing political ideologies. It was agreed upon that the Soviets would control the East and most of Berlin. However, the Western Allies insisted that they would not part with the symbolic German capital. In 1948, George Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State, proposed the Marshall Plan, a gift of U.S. funds to the crippled war-torn Western powers, along with implementing the German mark. It effectively began the process to jumpstart the German economy toward free market capitalism. Stalin, however, was angered that the U.S. had turned its back on the agreement in Potsdam, and as a result, the Soviets refused the money offered to the Eastern Bloc countries. This brewing tension led to an 11-month ordeal beginning in June of 1948, commonly known as the Berlin Airlift. The Soviets cut off the Autobahn leading to West Berlin in an attempt to gain full control of the city via starvation. The Allies responded by flying supplies nonstop into Berlin. Stalin's attempt to keep West Berlin under the thumb of the Eastern Bloc had failed, and the blockade of the city was lifted in May of 1949. At the onset of the 1950s, tensions between East and West sparked another critical conflict between the superpowers and another divided nation, Korea. The Korean War was the first of many East Asian conflicts that were to come about due to the U.S. fear of communism spreading, known as the domino effect. This fear was so great that in May of 1955, West Germany was urged to join NATO to solidify the situation in Europe. A few days later, the DDR was forced into the Warsaw Pact by the USSR to match the West move, while both sides were busy stockpiling nuclear weapons. Not only was the DDR forced into the pact, it was also in the middle of the worst economic downturn since the early 1920s. This forced many Easterners to emigrate to the West. Most of the citizens lost to the West were young Germans wishing to find better schooling and work opportunities. The Soviet Union, like the U.S., was trying to look more powerful than their counterpart. The governments had to act. The beginning of the 1960s dawned a new era in American politics with the election of President John F. Kennedy. The young and dynamic president was barely in office for more than 3 months when he ordered the Bay of Pigs. This was a complete and utter failure for the U.S. This not only was a major boost for the USSR in terms of publicity, but it provided an opportunity to seal on the Warsaw Pact. The USSR convened with Walter Ulbricht, the General Secretary of the DDR, on what to do about the mass exodus of people. With the USSR in control, plans for a wall began. Well, the official statement to the world was, no one has the intention of building a wall. The Bay of Pigs, an American refusal to withdraw troops from West Berlin, gave the justification the USSR needed to erect a wall on the 13th of August 1961. Many Easterners recognized their dwindling chance at freedom begin to drift away, and the most desperate Easterners leaped from their apartments on Bernauer Strasse to the western pavement below. Regarding the recent news in Berlin, President Kennedy opined in these words:
"There is a dangerous crisis in Berlin, and there is. It is because of threats against the vital interests and the deep commitments of the Western powers and the freedom of West Berlin. We cannot yield these interests. We cannot fail these commitments. We cannot surrender the freedom of these people, for whom we are responsible."
Later that year, in October, an American diplomat was halted before entering East Berlin. This was in direct opposition to the Potsdam Agreement of 1945, which agreed to let diplomats be immune to such stops by German police. General Lucius Clay, wanting to test the Soviets, sent in another diplomat the following day, who again was halted and denied entry. Soviet tanks were called in, and American tanks followed suit. A standoff had begun that could lead directly to the Third World War. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed that they must withdraw the tanks, which diffused the situation. Although it was almost the start of the Third World War, the West Germans respected Clay's actions, a small silver lining to what could have been nuclear winter. With the situation becoming more strenuous in Berlin for both sides, the year 1961 came and passed. In October 1962, the tension in Berlin would reach fever pitch. The U.S. discovered nuclear missiles in Cuba, thereby increasing the threat of a nuclear exchange between the U.S. and USSR. Kennedy realized that if he revealed the missiles in Cuba to the world, the Soviets may move into Berlin and push their armies through the Fulda Gap into West Germany. In order to avoid the start of World War III, fierce diplomacy ensued, and as a result, the U.S. and USSR agreed to withdraw missiles from each other's borders. Later, on the 26th of June 1963, Kennedy gave a speech in Berlin, commonly known as the Ich bin ein Berliner speech. It solidified the American commitment to the struggle of West Berlin. The speech had such a profound effect on the morale of the West Germans that the square where Kennedy gave the speech was renamed in his honor. But as U.S. forces prepared for war in Vietnam, the USSR and DDR continued strengthening their hold on the Eastern Bloc by reinforcing the wall. By 1971, the three Western allies and the Soviet Union signed the Quadriparty Agreement, enabling both Western and Eastern German citizens to freely travel inside Berlin using a visa. On paper, this relaxed tensions in Europe throughout the 70s and 80s, but despite the agreement, East German guards often failed to grant admittance, and Eastern visas were almost impossible to obtain. Refusal to recognize these visas only grew stronger as several successful escape attempts were aided by Westerners who had a visa. As time went on, the DDR Politburo increasingly cut itself off from Western economic influence. As a result, coal became the sole power source of the nation. The DDR quickly became one of the most polluted countries in all of Europe. This development stood in stark contrast to West Germany, which used cleaner energy and participated in various trade agreements with the other NATO countries, and as a result, the Western economy prospered throughout the 1970s and 80s. In fact, Western culture was so ubiquitous that Easterners listened to Western radio and TV, even though it was banned by the government. By the start of the 1980s, the quality of life on either side of the wall was remarkably different. West Germany, bolstered by NATO and the wildly successful Marshall Plan, churned out BMWs, Adidas sneakers, and Bayer aspirin for a growing world market. Whereas the USSR's planned economy in the DDR offered waiting lists of up to 10 years for a single Trabant, a small two-cylinder East German car. The USSR as a whole was suffering like the DDR. The new Soviet premier Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985. And as early as 1986 with Perestroika, he encouraged broad reform throughout the Eastern Bloc, and in one aspect the DDR already differed from the rest of the Eastern Bloc. It allowed only slightly more freedom in terms of civil society, but this allowed people to organize extremely vocal environmental groups that decried the government's irresponsible use of the land. In 1987, President Ronald Reagan visited West Berlin and voiced his vehement opposition to the wall. He called for Gorbachev to tear down the wall. However, before his speech, changes in the Eastern Bloc were already underway due to the influx of Western ideals from Gorbachev's earlier reforms. The speech itself had little effect on the DDR Politburo or the Kremlin, but it sticks out in the public eye even today due to the events just 2 years later. In the summer of 1989, the communist Hungarian government opened its border with Western Austria, allowing a loophole for citizens of the DDR to seek asylum into the West. Thousands poured through. The DDR grew desperate to retain its citizenry and planned to make visas more obtainable than ever before. But a typo on the official bill reported the visas as taking effect immediately. The typo led to thousands of East Berliners storming unprepared guards at crossing points along the wall. The wall was crumbling. Constant oppression and the low quality of life proved too much for the East Germans to endure. In the following weeks after the fall of the wall, Gorbachev publicly welcomed the change in the East-West relations. President Bush took a more laid-back approach to the diplomatic news and received heavy criticism for not praising the fall of the wall. But Bush decided to wait and resist the temptation to gloat as the fate of the Eastern Bloc was still uncertain. Within a year, the Easterners forced the government to provide free and fair elections. The curtain of concrete was finally lifted on October 3, 1990, as the former East Germany was removed from the Eastern Bloc and reunified with the West. 40 intense years of conflict and strife over multiple borders, languages, cultures, and ideologies ended in the blink of an eye. The wall was removed and the reforms that came to Germany took place across all former members of the Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union. Germany's curtain of concrete divided not only the city of Berlin, but the entire world. When the superpowers threatened to unleash a nuclear holocaust, Berlin's curtain of concrete was the physical embodiment of the global debate.